What is up, everybody? It is your boy, Hollywood AJ. It is fight week. We have a pay-per-view this weekend, UFC 266, Volkanovski versus Ortega. It's been a while since we had a UFC pay-per-view. Of course, the last one being UFC 265, Lewis versus Gane. The UFC since then has been laying pretty low, Of course, you had Jake Paul, Tyron Woodley fight that late August, and ever since then they haven't really been putting on the shows that we're accustomed to seeing. Of course, you sprinkle in a few fight nights here and there. Last weekend you had Anthony Smith versus Ryan Spann, but nothing too much to get the UFC world talking. Of course, you had Bellator, many other fight promotions going on, but finally the UFC is back and in full force. It is a very stacked card, from Darren Hooker fighting to Rosenstruik and Curtis Blades fighting, to even the return of Nick Diaz. Of course, you have the two titles on the line between Valentina Shevchenko and Lauren Murphy, and of course, Alexander Volkanovski and Brian Ortega. But as I mentioned, the return of the one and only Nick Diaz, the OG, triple OG of the fight game, is back after 6 years away. More on that later, but that's what this video is about. Not only the return, but my prediction for this upcoming fight card. Now, of course, I like to go through the whole card, but this weekend and for this episode, I'm going to go strictly through three fights, that being Diaz versus Lawler, Shevchenko versus Murphy, and of course, Volkanovski versus Ortega. So let's dive right into it. So Nick Diaz, as I mentioned, returning after 6 years, taking on Robbie Lawler. Now, this fight is for the hardcores, the true old school fans. This fight happened at UFC 47. 47. We're on UFC 266. That is insane. Truly insane. They were in the undercard of one of the biggest fights at that time, that being Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz. That just shows you how old school we're talking here, you guys. I was 3 years old, going on 4. This fight happened April 2nd of 2004. I was still a baby, 3 years old. I didn't see this fight happen till I was about 5 years old on Ultimate Knockouts, when I saw one of the greatest knockouts of all time. That being when Nick Diaz knocked out Robbie Lawler with the looping right hook that sent Robbie Lawler flat on his face. And ever since then, their careers kind of went in a same yet different direction. Of course, Nick Diaz went on to fight for Elite XC, Strikeforce, becoming one of the most dominant champions in Strikeforce history. And all in all, he truly became one of the most well-known fighters of all time. Defeating Cyborg, having that one-round war with Paul Daly. He was a true needle mover. Way before anyone knew who he was, Nick Diaz was a true raw talent. And mix that with some Stockton toughness, you get one of the biggest stars in MMA history. And of course, he became the champion, as I mentioned, and he just became one of the most dominant forces ever. But he came back to the UFC and kind of went on a skid. He hasn't had a win in 10 years. His last win came in October of 2011 against BJ Penn. And ever since then, he's been inactive. He fought once in 2012 against Carlos Condit. He fought once in 2013 against George St. Pierre, took all of 2014 off, and then fought in 2015 against Anderson Silva. And that's it. Ever since then, he has been away from the game. Of course, people want to bring up that suspension and it being 5 years for his use of marijuana in his fight against Anderson Silva. Yeah, I get all that, but that wasn't the true cause of why he was away for so long. His suspension was 5 years, but it was reduced to about 2. It ended in about 2017, 2018. And ever since then, he just didn't want to fight. He didn't want to fight. Nothing really appealed his urge to fight. So ever since then, he's been out for a long time. 6 years, as I just said many, many times. Then you have Robbie Lawler, who went away as well, had a few big fights outside of other promotions. He fought in the same promotions as Nick Diaz, that being Elite XC and Strikeforce. And he even became the champion in Elite XC and Strikeforce. So right away, we see these two had big success outside the UFC. And when they came back, Robbie Lawler had more success and more active duty than Nick Diaz. He became the UFC World Welterweight Champion in 2014, defeating Johnny Hendricks. He had wars with Rory McDonald and Carlos Condit. If you wonder what it's like to be an Ultimate fan, Robbie Lawler is obviously one of your favorite fighters of all time, period. And if you want to talk about some of your all-time favorite fights, you have to include his fight with Rory MacDonald in that conversation. Just has to. Just has to. One of the best fights ever. But after he lost his title fight to Tyron Woodley, Robbie Lawler has only won one fight in 4 years, that being against Donald Cerrone. He lost to Dos Anjos after that, then took all of 2018 off, then lost to Ben Askren, then lost to Covington, then lost to Neil Magny. So at this point in his career, we see that this fight between Nick Diaz and Robbie Lawler is the perfect fight for both of them. And it is the perfect fight for us hardcore fans. Now, there's rumblings and rumors saying that, this fight is going to be at 185, which leads into my prediction. With this fight being at 185, Nick Diaz is a more natural 185er than Robbie Lawler. Albeit Robbie Lawler was a champion, but Robbie Lawler is really small for the weight class. I feel this definitely benefits Nick, but one thing we have to consider is ring rust real or is it fake? Obviously, none of us really know the answer to that question. Only Nick knows. Therefore, he comes always in shape. Him and his brother do amazing triathlons 3-4 times a year. We know Nick Diaz is going to come in shape and ready to fight. But there's a difference between coming in shape and coming in fighting shape. Will Nick Diaz be as precise as he was back in 2008, 2010? Will he be as good on the ground as he was back in the day? Or will we see him fight the way he fought Anderson Silva, kind of nonchalant? He did land some really good punches against Anderson Silva, but as I mentioned, he was kind of going through the motions that night. It's really a tough pick, given the fact that these guys are coming toward the tail end of their career. It is a great fight for both fighters to truly catapult themselves to one last run at a world title. As far as my prediction goes, as I mentioned, the size differential, albeit size don't win fights, but both Diaz brothers walk around at about 200 pounds, and I just think that's going to be too much for Robbie. I think the first part of the fight is going to go Robbie's way. Let's not forget this is a 5-round fight, non-title fight. The only time they ever done that was, of course, when Nick's baby brother Nate fought Leon Edwards back in June at UFC 263. But all in all, I think the first part of the fight is going to go to Robbie Lawler. The more the fight goes longer, the more it favors Nick Diaz, and I think he ekes out a split decision in getting a win over Robbie Lawler. Period. That's it. Let's move on. Honestly, Valentina Shevchenko versus Lauren Murphy, I don't even have to make a prediction because I think all of us hardcore fight fans know what's going to happen. Lauren Murphy's probably one of the most nicest human beings ever, but she doesn't belong in the same octagon as Valentina Shevchenko. There's levels to this, and Valentina Shevchenko is at a point where she's just fighting to fight. There's no well-known contenders. There's no one that can really push Valentina Shevchenko, so therefore they're just feeding her these lambs, and she's just going to slaughter them. There's just not even going to be enough fighters for her to compete at the women's flyweight division. There's rumors saying she might fight Amanda Nunes. Of course, Amanda Nunes has to get past Juliana Pena. A lot of questions about the women's divisions that need to be answered, and we're going to get them this weekend. But as I mentioned, I kind of don't even really need to talk about this fight because Lauren Murphy is not going to do anything. Valentina Shevchenko just going to go out there. She's going to dominate like we're accustomed to seeing. So this prediction is going to be pretty quick. I got Valentina Shevchenko winning via second round TKO. Lauren Murphy's just not going to know what to do. Valentina's too well-rounded, too experienced. Her wrestling's too good. Lauren Murphy's tough, but it's just not going to get the job done this Saturday night. So therefore, Valentina Shevchenko wins via second round TKO. Then we move on to the main event of the evening, the fight that is kind of drawing us all to this main event. More on that later. But Alexander Volkanovski versus Brian Ortega. And I'm kind of perplexed, Alexander Volkanovski seems like a very nice guy. And Brian Ortega is one of the nicest guys ever. You put those two on The Ultimate Fighter, they got on each other's nerves. I've watched almost every single episode of this newest season because it's my all-time favorite show. And we got to see these guys get under each other's skin a little bit. You could tell they're jawing to fight. Let's not forget this fight was supposed to happen back in March. They were supposed to be the co-main event of Stipe versus Ngannou 2. And now we finally get the fight. This is an important fight for the featherweight division because we get to see, is Alexander Volkanovski for real? Is Brian Ortega worthy of getting another shot at the title? And it's just going to lay out the landscape of the rest of the division. You got Max Holloway fighting Yair Rodriguez. That's another important fight for the division on who will get the next shot at the title. But Alexander Volkanovski has only lost once in his career, back in his 4th professional fight. And ever since then, he hasn't looked back. He's been truly dominant. He's been doing everything he can, beating Jose Aldo, beating Chad Mendes, and then finally beating Max Holloway. Here's where I'm perplexed. In my honest opinion, and I've watched both Max Holloway fights between him and Volkanovski many, many times. And I'll be one of the many analysts, one of the many YouTubers to say this, but Alexander Volkanovski did not win that fight. Let's just call it how we see it. He did not win either of those fights. None of those fights. They were extremely close, but you don't take the belt away from the champion in a close fight like that. And in the second fight, Max Holloway definitely got 1 through 3. He dropped Volkanovski twice in rounds 1 and 2, and the only rounds that Volkanovski won were rounds 4 and 5. So right away, Volkanovski's like, oh, I'm the best. I beat Holloway twice. Bro, you barely beat him. Barely. You didn't beat him. And I'm sure Volkanovski's an outstanding guy. We've seen he's a great guy. He's a great coach, but he did not win those fights. For him to have the audacity to truly call himself the champion, it is mind-boggling. It's really, really mind-boggling, and I don't like it. Me personally, I think he's a paper champion, and I think Brian Ortega is going to prove it. Brian Ortega, on the other hand, has had an amazing career. He's had only 1 loss. He's great on the ground. He's gotten more improved on the feet, and we've seen it in the Korean Zombie fight. That fight was almost a year ago. We thought, okay, with Brian Ortega taking 2 years off, completely reinventing himself, what is he going to be like? Is he going to be the Brian Ortega we're accustomed to seeing, or is he going to do what a lot of fighters do, and that's fade after a big-time title fight loss? But, man, he shut a lot of the critics up. He dominated Korean Zombie. I mean, without even his jiu-jitsu. It was a 5-round stand-up clinic from Brian Ortega, and we saw he added more to his arsenal that we never saw before. A lot of his fights were won on the ground via submission, triangle, guillotine. Even in the Frankie Edgar fight, we saw him knock Frankie Edgar out with that amazing Mike Tyson-esque uppercut that truly catapulted him into stardom. And that fight is what got him that title shot. Now, I'm going to get into my prediction. Brian Ortega is going to win. I don't see Volkanovski winning this fight at all unless he wins like his last 2 fights via robbery. I don't think Volkanovski is on Brian Ortega's level. Brian Ortega has added many more stand-up tools to his game. And Volkanovski, if he takes Brian Ortega down, that's just in Brian Ortega's world. You might as well go walk into a lion's den at that point, because Brian Ortega is a monster on the ground. You do not want to take this fight down. So obviously, Volkanovski's want to keep this fight standing up, want to get inside, do a little bit of dirty boxing, while Brian Ortega has the size advantage. He has the reach advantage. He's going to try and keep him on the outside, pep him up with shots. So therefore, I see Brian Ortega truly outlanding Alexander Volkanovski. Not only outlanding him, I see him dropping Alexander Volkanovski and getting a rear naked choke victory. So that way, he will be the new featherweight champion of the world. He will be the 5th undisputed featherweight champion of the world. The first 4, Jose Aldo, Conor McGregor, Max Holloway, and Alexander Volkanovski. 4, Brian Ortega will be the 5th undisputed UFC featherweight champion of the world. Hopefully Max Holloway does his thing, and we can get one of the biggest rematches of all time in Brian Ortega and Max Holloway. As I mentioned, sure, Volk is a nice guy, but he just does not deserve to be the champion. He doesn't need to be the champion, and for him to have the audacity to say that he is the champion is truly one of the most blasphemous things to come out of a champion's mouth. And I think Brian gets it done via 4th round rear naked choke. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Comment on who you think will win those 3 fights, along with other fights on the card. Go ahead, click that subscribe button for weekly content. I promise you, it will change your life.